In the summer of 1944, the world was still at war, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Cities across Europe lay in ruins, Asia was burning, and millions of soldiers were still dying for territory that would soon be irrelevant. Because far from the front lines, in a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire, a different war was already being decided. Not a war of armies or borders, but a war over money. And the winners of that war would shape the global economy for generations. 44 nations sent delegates to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. Officially, they came to prevent another Great Depression, to design stability, to promise cooperation after chaos. But beneath that language sat a harsher reality. Whoever controlled the post-war monetary system would control reconstruction, trade, credit, and ultimately sovereignty itself. This was not about peace. It was about leverage. The United States arrived at Bretton Woods unlike any other power in history. Its factories were intact. Its industrial capacity was unmatched. Most critically, it held the majority of the world's monetary gold. While Europe had spent blood and treasure, America had accumulated claims. By the time the conference began, the dollar was already strong. Bretton Woods was about making that strength permanent. What happened inside that hotel room was not accidental, and it was not temporary. A system was designed that tied every major currency to the dollar, and the dollar to gold, placing the United States at the center of global finance. From that moment forward, international trade, national budgets, and personal savings would all orbit a single currency. If the dollar moved, the world moved with it. Most people never learn this history. But every paycheck you earn, every price you pay, and every debt you carry traces back to those weeks in 1944. Because the modern financial system was not discovered, it was engineered. After Bretton Woods, the story told to the public was reassuring, almost noble. The world, scarred by depression and war, had learned its lesson. A new monetary system, people were told, would bring stability, fairness, and shared growth. Gold backing would prevent recklessness. Fixed exchange rates would stop competitive devaluations. International institutions would protect weaker nations from chaos. Money, at last, would be governed responsibly. That story was never meant to be questioned. What was never explained is that the system was not designed to eliminate imbalance, but to manage it in a way that favored the issuer of the reserve currency. Discipline was not universal, it was selective. For most countries, discipline meant austerity. It meant defending currency pegs through wage suppression, spending cuts, and social strain. For the United States, discipline was optional. The gold standard was presented as a neutral anchor. In reality, it functioned as a constraint only for those who lacked monetary power. Other nations had to earn dollars through exports or borrow them at interest. America created dollars at will, knowing global demand would absorb them. The burden of adjustment never fell on the center. It was dispersed outward, diluted across every economy dependent on dollar liquidity. This is the lie at the heart of Bretton Woods. The system was never symmetrical. It did not ask everyone to play by the same rules. It established a hierarchy and then disguised it as cooperation. Stability was real, but it was stability built on dependency. Prosperity existed, but it flowed upward and inward. And once that structure was in place, everything that followed became predictable. Once Bretton Woods was in place, the mechanics of power became invisible to most people, but brutally clear to governments. Every major currency was tied to the dollar. The dollar alone was tied to gold. That single design choice turned American money into the bloodstream of global trade. If a country wanted to rebuild, industrialize, or simply participate in international commerce, it needed dollars first. That requirement changed everything. Countries no longer competed only on productivity or innovation. They competed for access to dollar flows. Exports were not just about growth. They were about survival. Trade surpluses became lifelines. Trade deficits became existential threats. And because dollars were created only in one place, the system ensured that global economic activity depended on decisions made in Washington. The arrangement looked stable on paper, but it created a hidden imbalance. As global trade expanded, the world needed more dollars to function. The only way to supply those dollars was for the United States to send them abroad. That meant running persistent trade deficits. American consumption fed global liquidity, while American debt became the anchor holding the system together. For a time, this contradiction was masked by gold. As long as foreign governments believed every dollar could be converted into metal, trust held. But trust was doing more work than anyone admitted. The system required faith that America would restrain itself, even as it enjoyed privileges no other country possessed. This is the part rarely explained. Bretton Woods did not freeze the world into balance. It locked the world into dependence on a single issuer's choices. Stability existed, but it was conditional. It lasted only as long as belief did. And belief, once tested, never recovers quietly. Power in the Bretton Woods system did not sit where most people thought it did. It was not evenly distributed among nations, and it was not constrained by formal promises. It concentrated quietly in the institutions that controlled access to dollars and dictated the conditions under which those dollars could be used. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were presented as neutral guardians of stability. In practice, they became enforcement mechanisms. For countries outside the center, access to global finance came with strings attached. Loans were never just loans. They were contracts that rewrote domestic policy. Governments seeking dollars were required to open markets, reduce public spending, deregulate industries, and prioritize debt repayment over social needs. These were framed as technical adjustments, but their consequences were deeply political. Economic sovereignty was traded for liquidity. Meanwhile, the United States faced no comparable constraints. It did not need permission to issue dollars. It did not submit to external oversight. It was both the referee and the primary beneficiary of the game. Voting power inside these institutions reflected this reality. Decisions aligned consistently with American interests, even when the costs were borne elsewhere. This is how control operated without armies. No invasion was necessary. A country could be pressured simply by restricting its access to dollars. Currencies collapsed. Imports became unaffordable. Inflation surged. Political unrest followed. Eventually, compliance returned. Not because the system was fair, but because alternatives were structurally blocked. Bretton Woods did not eliminate imperial influence. It transformed it. Power no longer arrived by gunboat. It arrived through balance sheets, conditional loans, and the silent authority of a currency everyone needed but only one country could create. Every monetary system built on contradiction survives only as long as belief outruns arithmetic. Bretton Woods was no exception. For nearly 2 decades after the war, the structure appeared stable. Trade expanded. Reconstruction succeeded. The dollar circulated everywhere, and confidence held. But beneath that surface, the system was quietly consuming itself. To function, the world needed a constant supply of dollars. To supply those dollars, the United States had to run permanent deficits. It had to import more than it exported, spend more than it earned, and allow dollars to accumulate abroad. At first, this seemed manageable. America still held vast gold reserves, and few questioned its ability to honor convertibility. But the numbers did not stop growing. By the early 1960s, foreign-held dollars exceeded the gold backing them. On paper, the promise still existed. In reality, it had become mathematically impossible. If every dollar holder demanded gold at once, the system would collapse instantly. Bretton Woods was no longer a guarantee. It was a gamble. Some governments noticed sooner than others. France, under Charles de Gaulle, openly challenged the arrangement. Instead of recycling dollars back into American assets, it demanded gold. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Gold left American vaults. Other countries watched carefully and began to calculate their own exposure. This was the moment when Bretton Woods stopped being a system and became a liability. The United States faced an impossible choice: impose discipline on itself and accept economic contraction, or abandon the promise that underpinned global trust. In August 1971, it chose power over restraint. When the gold window closed, Bretton Woods did not fail quietly. It ended because its internal logic could no longer survive reality. When Bretton Woods collapsed in 1971, it was framed as a technical adjustment, a temporary measure to protect stability. Most people barely noticed. There were no emergency broadcasts explaining what fiat money meant, no warnings about how radically the rules had changed. But from that moment forward, the relationship between work, savings, and security was permanently altered. Without gold as a constraint, money creation was no longer limited by physical reality. Governments could spend first and justify later. Deficits stopped being exceptions and became policy. Inflation was no longer an accident. It became a feature. And inflation does not hit everyone equally. It quietly transfers wealth away from those who live on wages and fixed incomes toward those who own assets that rise with price levels. This is why life began to feel harder even as productivity increased. Wages stopped keeping pace with prices. Savings lost purchasing power year after year. Homes, once tied loosely to income, became speculative assets. Debt filled the gap. Credit cards, student loans, mortgages, all expanded not because people became irresponsible, but because the monetary system required constant borrowing to sustain growth. Ordinary workers were told the problem was personal. Budget better. Work harder. Invest smarter. What they were never told is that the system itself now depended on their permanent financial pressure. Stability at the top required insecurity at the bottom. From that point on, money no longer measured value. It measured access. And access was increasingly reserved for those closest to the source of creation. This is how a monetary decision made decades earlier reached into everyday life, shaping what people could afford, what they could save, and what they could never quite escape. Bretton Woods was never just a historical agreement. It was a decision about who would carry risk and who would issue promises. In 1944, those promises were anchored to gold. In 1971, they were cut loose. What remained was not freedom, but dependence on trust in institutions that no longer had natural limits. For more than half a century since, the global economy has run on that trust. Central banks expand balance sheets. Governments roll debt forward. Markets assume stability will always be restored with more liquidity. And most people are told this is normal, that this is how modern money must work. But history suggests otherwise. Monetary systems built on unlimited claims eventually confront reality. Not all at once, but unevenly, painfully, and without warning for those least prepared. The consequence is not just inflation or currency risk. It is the quiet erosion of predictability. Planning a future becomes harder when the unit used to measure value is constantly changing. Saving becomes an act of faith. Work becomes disconnected from security. And the gap between those who can protect themselves inside the system and those who cannot continues to widen. Bretton Woods created a world where money became an instrument of policy before it remained a store of value. Its collapse did not end that logic. It intensified it. What replaced gold was not neutrality, but discretion. And discretion always flows upward. Understanding this history does not offer easy solutions. It offers something more uncomfortable: clarity. Clarity about why the system feels unstable. Clarity about why effort alone no longer guarantees security. And clarity about why the rules seem invisible until they fail. History does not repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend the pressure is accidental.